Okay. Hello and welcome. Good evening, everyone. So tonight we have the honor and privilege to host Dr. Ilene Grabel of the University of Denver, who is going to talk to us about the American financial order, which is crumbling and which apparently is a good thing too. Before giving the floor to Dr. Grabel, let me introduce her. Ilene Grabel is Distinguished Professor at the University of Denver and Professor of International Finance at the Joseph Grabel School of International Studies of the University of Denver in the United States. So she co-directs the graduate program in Global Finance, Trade, and Economic Integration at the Grabel School. She's also a faculty affiliate at the C. Cho Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy and the Schooner Institute of Public Policy at the Grabel School. Her research and teaching interests focus on the political economy of international financial policy, institutions and financial flows, global financial governance, global regional and trans-regional financial architectures, and finance and economic development. Her most recent book, When Things Don't Fall Apart, Global Financial Governance and Developmental Finance in an Age of Productive Incoherence, won several awards, including the 2019 European Association of the Evolutionary Political Economy Myrdal Prize, the International Studies Association's 2019 International Political Economy Best Book Award, and the 2018 British International Studies Association IPE Book Prize. She has been a consultant to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and the United Nations Development Program on several occasions. She received her PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and her research has been published in leading economics and political science journals in the field. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Grabel, but before that, let me thank my colleague, Dr. Elisa Görge, once again for allowing me to introduce Dr. Grabel today. So as you very well know, normally Dr. Görge runs the Bilkent IR series. Ilene, we are waiting to, we're looking forward to your excellent talk and comments.
Great, thank you. It's such an honor to be here. I very much appreciate the invitation. I wish very much I could be with all of you in person, but I'm just so pleased to be here, at least in this capacity. Thanks so much to my old friend, Sechkin. We first met when we were working on the Review of International Political Economy together. And so it's just been wonderful to reconnect in this way. And many thanks to Elisa as well for allowing me to jump into this seminar series. What I want to talk about today, this evening, is some of the arguments that I develop in my book that Sechin so graciously introduced, and also some ways in which I've tried to extend and elaborate the arguments in the book in a recent paper that I wrote in conjunction with a project on the fracturing of the American order and the waxing and waning of neoliberalism. And so that gave me the opportunity to really think about how some of the arguments in my book might be extended during the unraveling of the Trump era and the beginnings of the Biden era, and what all of that means for liberalism and the American order. So let me just begin my remarks with some controversial claims. The first controversial claim that I'd like to make is that there's one thing about which we can feel pretty good about right now. And that's a kind of hard mindset to maintain given the miseries of the pandemic. And let me throw out a few other provocations as well. One is that former President Trump's actions hastened the end of the American financial order, an order that was already unraveling before Trump took office. The other provocation that I'd like to make is that the unraveling of the American financial order is a good thing when we consider the prospects for rearticulations of embedded liberalisms. And I make no predictions in my work, but I do try to push back against the presumption that embedded liberalism is on a death watch. And instead, what I argue is that in limited domains, what I identify as incoherence in global financial governance is creating opportunities for reconstituted embedded liberalisms, in the plural. And I think this is the case even though financial incoherence also incorporates retrograde impulses and severe risks at the present time. And so my point is that the emerging regime reflects neither your grandmother's embeddedness nor her liberalism, but it may end up achieving some of the results of her embedded liberalism nonetheless. And before I try to sell you on my arguments, let me say a little bit more about American financial orders. There have been two distinct American-led financial orders. The first American financial order emerged in the post-World War II context. That was an order that was marked by a unipolar global financial governance architecture organized around the US dollar and the Bretton Woods institutions and the dominance of Keynesian and associated embedded liberal ideas. The financial order that was built around this vision had a coherent, streamlined, centripetal character. The multilateralism in this first period was permissive and provided space for cross-national domestic policy heterogeneity. And in fact, that was built into Article 4 of the IMF's Articles of Agreements. This first financial order began to unravel in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The second American financial order unfolded in the 1970s through the early 2000s. The second or neoliberal order featured finance untethered, dominant, and globally integrated. It celebrated markets and trade and investment agreements and their role in disciplining governments, and it promoted convergence around US economic policy and institutional norms. The neoliberalism of the second order reinforced existing US-led financial unipolarity, and it amplified the role and the power of the Bretton Woods institutions and US financial interests around the world. With some exceptions, this order reflected and promoted the liberalized American financial model as a global ideal. Rampant inequality, retrogressive nationalism and populism, and financial crises in the global South and the global East are all legacies of the neoliberal era. The crises of the 1990s, especially the East Asian financial crises of 1997 and 1998, are important to the story that I'm telling because they mark the beginning of the end of the second order. Now, the crises of the 1990s, and especially the global financial crisis of 2008, I think had contradictory effects on the financial order and neoliberalism. It deepened fissures in the US-led regime, while in some ways also reinforcing the US's central role. Now, before leaving this account of financial orders, I just want to be clear, and I don't want to be misunderstood as suggesting that the two American-led financial orders were internally consistent or all-encompassing, whereas the current moment is uniquely marked by incoherence. Coherence is always a matter of degree. It's not a matter of present versus absent. These earlier eras were coherent only in comparison with the present period. Okay, so where does all of this leave us now? I think the best that can be said is that we're in a period between periods, an interregnum, in which there isn't a coherent singular ism or contending system of economic arrangements. Instead, what we confront is the simultaneous proliferation of regimes that include kleptocratic capitalism, state capitalism, social democratic multilateralism, neoliberal nationalism, neo-nationalism, and what I call embedded populism. A larger range of actors and institutions have joined the conversation in global economic governance, pushing forward with ambitious new initiatives. Some of these initiatives are encouraging, while others definitely are not encouraging. Now, interregnums are unwelcome by social scientists, and especially by economists, trained as we are to value analytical fastidiousness, certainty, and coherence. And I call that longing for coherence, ism, by the need to capture the proliferation of discordant tendencies in a neat analytical package, some ism or other, so that we can impose analytical order. I think today we're lacking in that new ism, and instead we confront the 2020s anxious about the shape of what's emerging and what's to come. A post-American, post-neoliberal order may emerge, but at present it's really difficult to see where the seeds of a new order lie. And I maintain that the unease helps to really explain the continuing appeal of what I term in my book, the continuity view, the view that in the absence of a well-defined ism, nothing of consequence has changed. Those advocating continuity in the strongest sense argue that we remain locked in a coherent neoliberal order. Sustaining continuity requires the need to make the case again and again that the US is still top dog, and proving that the US is still top dog, I think, is taken by many advocates of continuity as a rejoinder to the naivete of those like me who hold less certain and messier views of the present and of the near future. And just to head off confusion, let me just say that there is no doubt that the US has powerful legacy advantages and that the US Federal Reserve and the dollar still matter a lot. But that concession, I think, doesn't undermine the point that the world, well before the COVID crisis, bore little resemblance to the world of the Second American Order. Features of an order can persist long after order-giving capacities have evaporated. Now, most observers see this kind of aperture or opening as problematic. I view these things differently. If this period of aperture has one dominant feature, again, it's that it's incoherent. And by incoherent, what I mean is that the landscape of global economic governance, especially when it comes to finance, features fragmentation, conflict, experimentation, proliferation, and unevenness. There is no ism. Instead, there's a proliferation of conflicting norms and strategies and a profound nostalgia for the tidiness of the first and the second American orders, even among critics, because the playbook seemed clear. Advocates knew what they were pushing for, and critics knew what they were up against. Nostalgia, I think, also stems from the fact that the first order looks awfully good from where we stand right now. In contrast, many fewer are mourning the eclipse of the second order, given the ravages caused by neoliberal convergence. Now, writing during a previous interregnum, Antonio Gramsci spoke of the morbid symptoms that were apparent as the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born. And I think this is an apt description of the current conjuncture. I acknowledge that it's extraordinarily difficult to find much to celebrate about the current conjuncture. Morbid symptoms of the current conjuncture include deeply threatening risks emanating from the destructive aspects of today's incoherence. Among the destructive aspects of today's incoherence include, just for example, the pervasive nature of financial fragilities, the fact that post-war cooperative traditions and institutions of multilateralism are under assault, and where they're not under assault, they're being hollowed out. Central banks in many countries have exhausted their arsenals, and conflict between the US and China is recruiting their central banks into a currency war. The populist anti-Federal Reserve rhetoric of the Trump years in the US has now morphed into specious fears of inflation circa the 1970s. Domestic and international politics are inward and nasty as a Polanyian double movement plays out in many contexts. The counter movement has many roots, and I think among the most important are the real and perceived damages associated with the creation of a coherent, internationally integrated system under the banner of neoliberalism and elite-led cosmopolitanism. Progressive and retrograde deglobalization impulses substantially weaken the prospects of collective responses to challenges in the global commons, such as the refugee, the climate, public health, and imminent financial crises. And so without denying or downplaying the risks that I've just enumerated, I do want to suggest that today's incoherence also includes some productive and even transformative moments. In my work, I've deliberately used the provocative term productive incoherence to really capture this idea. Productive incoherence is deeply indebted to Albert Hirschman's epistemic and theoretical commitments. Albert Hirschman's embrace of what he called possibilism and his epistemic commitment to uncertainty and humility led him to reject entirely the social scientist's penchant for pre-narrating the future. Hirschman also emphasized the vital role of experimentation, pragmatic problem solving in response to unforeseen or underestimated challenges, the centrality of learning by doing and learning from others, the virtues of messiness over real and contrived coherence and parsimony. Hirschman urged us to look at processes of change in the small and to interrogate grand narratives and the tendency to valorize epical visions of institutional and ideational change. And these are the key features of what I've termed in my work a Hirschmanian mindset. And this mindset really informs the claims that I'm advancing today. I think incoherence in global financial governance should be understood as productive in several respects. It's creating and widening spaces in which some of the values, practices, tools, objectives, and goals associated with embedded liberalism might be rearticulated in a world in which there is no order, American-led or otherwise. I think incoherence is creating what we might think of as exits or leakages from a noxious national and global policy environment, rendering it somewhat less poisonous than it would be in the absence of intellectual aperture, contestation and competing policies, institutions, networks, and poles of power. The abdication by the US of its traditional role under American orders 1.0 and 2.0 is creating opportunities for more permissive and varied re-embeddedness and diverse structures of economic integration. Agile, pragmatic, ideationally elastic network actors and those that enjoy high levels of policy autonomy are in the best position to thrive in an environment of incoherence. China is, of course, the exemplar in this connection. The evolving Bretton Woods institutions and many new players in the financial landscape are stepping forward with strategies that defy theoretical encapsulation. And just to be clear, my intervention shouldn't be read as deriving from an optimistic disposition, driving us to see just the upside and not also the downsides of the current conjuncture. And that's something I want to return to that point later. But I do seek to push back from what Hirschman identified as feudalism. By feudalism, he referred to the common social scientific indulgence to pronounce on the inadequacies in emerging experiments. Hirschman pointed out that such narratives have performative force, undermining initiatives that might otherwise flourish. And so my goal is to really explore spaces where aperture and agency are emerging as sites of possibility. The crumbling of the American financial order, I think, is providing many such spaces, even while it creates serious risks. An unscripted world provides opportunities for actors to carve out new roles for better or worse. And so let me now sketch out in the broadest strokes features of global financial governance in the present period, drawing attention to those aspects that I think bear most directly on the fate of embedded liberalisms. My chief argument is that the evolving incoherent nature of global financial governance in the current environment can support the financial pillars of rearticulated, heterogeneous, embedded liberalisms, along with other and much less appealing isms. One recurring outcome of the global financial crisis of 2008 is that it undermined the financial monoculture of the second order. In fact, the global financial crisis deeply tarnished claims for the superiority and the universality of the US financial model. The crisis validated the claims of critics in the US, China, and elsewhere who had long identified the failings of this model. Policymakers in the global South and the global East exploited the global crisis and the post-global crisis environment to call for alternatives to a US financial order. That call came most explicitly and regularly from Chinese officials, though others made similar calls. A range of early stage innovations and blue sky discussions among both US friends and US foes have sought to gradually reduce dependence on the dollar and to provide protection from the weaponization of the US dollar, the weaponization of the US financial system, and the weaponization of trade relations. And I think that became increasingly appealing as the Trump administration grew increasingly committed to intensifying and diversifying the channels through which US economic relations were weaponized. It's unclear now whether secondary sanctions will remain a part of US economic statecraft under the Biden administration, but the early tough talk coming from the Biden administration on China and President Xi's equally tough rejoinders to the US and Alaska last week at least suggest that it might. Now, returning to the idea of an American financial order, I'll note that the former governor of England's central bank, Mark Carney, has argued for several years that the world's reliance on the dollar won't hold, in his words, and he has called for the IMF to take charge of a multipolar system of currencies, including a network of central bank created digital currencies. The trade and the currency wars unleashed by Trump provided additional momentum to the case against the US financial model. The erratic nationalism of the Trump administration widened the void in global economic governance that was first opened under the Obama administration's refusal to accept China's invitation to join the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in 2015. Chinese policymakers don't share the vision of universality that the US held in both the embedded liberal and the neoliberal era. Important features of the Chinese financial model are consistent with or support a form of embedded liberalism distinct from that of the first American financial order. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that the end of the hegemony of the US financial model created space for a pluriculture of hybridized rather than ism-driven financial models. China's model is the most legible of these alternatives, but there are other approaches in Korean, Indian, Malaysian, Brazilian, and within Islamic finance, which represent alternative modes for organizing finance. Now, another change in the financial landscape that I want to highlight involves central banks. During the global financial crisis, central banks in wealthy countries pivoted in the direction of what we might think of as embedded central banking, and they normalized what was originally termed unconventional monetary policies. This entails policy decisions that reach beyond a single-minded pursuit of inflation targeting to a broader range of objectives, such as systemic risk, asset bubbles, and currency misalignments. During the COVID crisis, central banks in wealthy countries became lender of last resort, not only to the financial sector, but also to the real sector. And they began to discuss the development of tools to green monetary policy and to use it to address inequalities, and in some cases, to address or examine structural racism. And to be clear, inflation targeting fell away as the primary objective of central bank agendas in wealthy countries, less as an indicative of a change in their priorities, but rather of the deflationary environment in which they found themselves during and since the global crisis. All this said, these aren't happy times for central bankers. They've been involved in conflicts reminiscent of the 1930s. The environment involves attacks on their credibility and performance and threats to their independence. And of course, Turkey's president has been twice able to do what former President Trump openly fantasized about on many occasions, and that was to fire a central bank governor that was unwilling to bend to his will. Central banks have been on the defensive in the last year because of the recent reanimation of inflation hawks in some national contexts. Another feature of an evolving global financial landscape that I'd like to highlight involves the normalization of capital control policies. Capital controls, as is well known, were central to the financial stability of the first American financial order. They fell out of favor during the long neoliberal era. As the global financial crisis emerged, capital controls were resurrected. They were used successfully by a large, diverse set of countries. Central bankers, the IMF, and even credit rating agencies now see capital controls as legitimate parts of the policy toolkit. And the implications for the emergence of embedded liberalisms, I think, are profound. Most immediately, the restoration of capital controls provide a degree of policy autonomy as countries in the global South and East shoulder the effects of currency depreciations, capital flight, financial crisis, and severe economic and social dislocation associated with the COVID crisis. And indeed, IMF staff recently highlighted the role that capital controls can play in this context. And I think this is in keeping with the insulating and supportive role that capital controls played in the embedded liberal era. Beyond the serious challenges of the COVID crisis, capital controls have an important role to play in curbing illicit financial flows. Now, the current situation of the Bretton Woods institutions warrants mention. Former President Trump's Treasury team and his appointments to the IMF and the World Bank displayed the administration's signature hostility to multilateral organizations and to multilateralism, along with the hope of weakening those institutions from within. That attack really was intended to hollow out the Bretton Woods institutions, in part to deny China and other countries a foothold to extend their role in global economic affairs. The Trump strategy of hollowing out the Bretton Woods institutions was short-sighted and rendered the institutions less ready for the challenges of the pandemic. Indeed, the US Treasury under Trump blocked efforts to increase the capacity of the IMF during the COVID crisis by blocking the allocation of a large new tranche of special drawing rights to IMF members. Current US Treasury Secretary Yellen recently noted that she is reassessing that proposal. And so this is a time of great uncertainty at and for the Bretton Woods institutions. There are some signs of evolution in ideology and strategies, as with the case of capital controls that I mentioned. In addition, the IMF has a new open-minded approach to industrial policy that finally catches the institution up with what we know of as decades of research by developmental state scholars. And even while the Bretton Woods institutions were being hollowed out, countries of the global South and East twice took the unprecedented step of lending money to the institutions rather than borrowing from them, beginning to maneuver more efficaciously within them, and taking on more influential roles at the institutions. The Trump attack on the Bretton Woods institutions incentivized friend and foe to create new institutions and linkages that circumvent and constrain US influence over financial flows and financial governance. In fact, the global crisis catalyzed the construction of more densely populated financial institutional landscapes, something that was already threatening the privileged place of the US before Trump. The crisis occasioned the creation of new financial institutions, financed, helmed, and based in the global South and the global East. These institutions are networked with one another and increasingly networked with the IMF. I think a more densely populated, pluripolar global financial architecture is more likely to be tolerant or supportive of experimentation and a diversity of economic models, and to enable a variety of embedded liberalisms. That's not the case in an architectural monoculture that exerts a kind of gravitational pull toward a single idealized model. Now, the last facet of incoherence that I'd like to mention involves conflicting trends pointing towards deglobalization, reglobalization, networked bilateralism, and new multilateralisms. During the first and the second American orders, lending by the Bretton Woods institutions amplified and transmitted policy norms and reinforced the US's central role in global finance. Today, China's international lending, aid, investment, emerging vaccine diplomacy, and interest in a Trumpian-style economic sanctions program reinforced China's role in reshaping the global financial landscape. China is the world's largest official creditor, as I know we all know. It has lent more than twice as much as the World Bank and the IMF combined in recent years. During the global financial crisis, the Chinese government positioned itself as a savior of multilateralism, even though its approach is much more accurately described as networked bilateralism. The government also signaled its commitment to reglobalization during the global crisis by providing finance to Eurozone institutions, by launching the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, and other new loan and aid programs. China rebranded its role in the COVID crisis after months of mismanagement and misinformation. The country announced new funding to the WHO following President Trump's decision to halt funding. China has also donated and sold medical supplies on several continents and sent medical personnel abroad. China is also developing CIPS as an alternative to the West's dominant financial messaging platform, which is called SWIFT, and it is also supporting the internationalization of the RMB. China's officials have seized the stage on many occasions to defend the benefits of global integration, often speaking of the constructive role of the BRICS, but more recently of its own constructive role. Now, the project around developing alternatives to SWIFT has caught the attention of US foes and friends who are keen to protect themselves from actual or prospective US sanctions. European officials are playing the long game with a 10 to 20 year project to build a new financial clearinghouse called INSTEX, which may function alongside or be an alternative to the US-centric CHIPS and SWIFT clearinghouse and financial messaging platforms. Now, many observers worry about the kind of reglobalization and integration that's emerging as China steps into the void created by the fracturing of post-war traditions of multilateralism and the rise of illiberal nationalisms. Others raise concerns about the construction of a parallel system that's driven by expanding demand for infrastructure finance globally, and of course now by global demand for vaccines. More immediate concerns raised by China's lending include financial fragility induced by overlending, influence over borrowers and control over natural resources, and the carbon footprint of China's loans. But I think we have to be aware that China is not the only actor promoting reglobalization and new forms of integration. There's substantial support for as yet unspecified, but presumably modernized, heterogeneous, and permissive liberal multilateralisms coming from French, Canadian, and German heads of state, and also from IMF leadership. US President Biden has obviously been talking recently about reviving multilateralism as well. And so I think the chief inference to be drawn at this point is that the shape of economic integration is being contested and reshaped. The most likely outcome in the near and medium term involves a combination of deglobalization, reglobalization, networked bilateralism, and diverse multilateralisms against the backdrop of illiberal nationalisms. And so my point is that the goals of embedded liberalism may be becoming available, even if the mid-20th century form has passed us by. I think nostalgia for those earlier forms is not called for. 20th century embedded liberalism depended on a particular unipolar system of global financial governance that was biased in terms of its benefits and its costs. It was biased toward the global north, toward large firms, toward white men, toward the able-bodied. New forms of social protection that can arise in the next context of productive incoherence might be more heterogeneous in form and effects, but might also be more suited to the institutional configurations and needs of diverse countries. Not all of these promise to be benign. Indeed, the nationalist illiberal impulses so much on display in the world today suggest that social protections will be sought via beggar thy neighbor strategies, cronyist configurations, racism, misogyny, xenophobia, and other means that offload risks onto weaker parties at home and abroad. And at one extreme, in fact, these strategies test the limits of what we even mean by liberalism. I think they're better characterized as what I call embedded populisms. The US case, I think, is particularly illustrative of the many risks associated with incoherence. Indeed, destructive incoherence becomes more apparent daily in the US as the COVID crisis unfolds. Destructive incoherence is also on display in the failure to develop a coordinated global or even an EU-wide response to the COVID crisis. Now, that said, many European states are continuing to hold down features of the embedded liberalism pole, though of course there are important exceptions, such as Macron's liberalization of labor markets. Nonetheless, in many European contexts, furloughed workers were supported in ways that were inconceivable in the US. And even Germany moved away from its deficit obsession early in the COVID crisis. Thus, which countries support the tent poles of embedded liberalism and how they do so, I think, is fluid and evolving. We can also situate countries like China, India, and other developmental states, and even states with more liberal politics like Chile at various points along the continuum, reflecting a contradictory mix of liberal and illiberal strategies that promote social protection. Examples of embedded populism include the Trump administration's decision to bail out large firms while starving state and local governments and hospitals of much needed funds, while stirring anti-Asian nativism and exploiting historical racism against Blacks and Black Americans. Another example of embedded populism is given by attacks on central bank independence by both Trump and Erdogan, as are sanctions against Iran. From Karl Polanyi's perspective, Trump and embedded populism, I think, can be understood as a reaction against the social damage wrought by the pursuit of neoliberal coherence. The neoliberalism and the elite-led globalization of the second American-led order bred resentment against its victims and really primed them for illiberal leaders that were peddling contrived analyses and contrived solutions. I nonetheless hold that the present incoherence creates space that was unavailable under neoliberalism. It provides opportunities for varied forms of re-embeddedness, along with permissive and diverse forms of economic integration. Incoherence in systems creates space for experimentation, heterogeneity, and complexity. This despite the fact that incoherence also creates the space for discord, nationalism, racism, and authoritarianism. Polanyi, above all others, understood the simultaneity of risk and opportunities. Wisely, he provides us with no reassuring guarantees. And I'll just close here, it's the last set of general comments, to say that the original embedded liberalism of the post-war era was based on rules with universal aspirations and formal multilateral institutions that were seen as necessary to protect an open international economic order that had the US at its unquestioned center. Perhaps in light of the uneven changes that I've highlighted in my talk, we should think more about how to nurture informal and varied networked, cross-cutting, messy, embedded liberalisms coexisting in a world marked by many other isms. If the present period has one thing in common with the embedded liberal era, it is that both provide space for national heterogeneity. Today's permissiveness is not driven by expert consensus on the importance of heterogeneity or the presence of a framework of multilateralism that supports heterogeneity. Of course, that is not a kind of expert consensus at the present time. I think it remains an open question as to whether or not the Biden administration will succeed in its vision of restoring, modernizing, and multilateralizing the US role in international affairs, or whether or not the Biden administration will founder in nostalgia for a moment that has thankfully passed. Rather, it is in the nature of uncertainty that I think marks interregnums that openings emerge for policy autonomy. Making space for alternative embedded liberalisms necessitates a degree of permissiveness in the international order, what Danny Roderick refers to as thin versions of globalization. And it may be that thin versions of globalization are all that's possible or even desirable given the pending conclusion of the end of the era of US hegemony. It's in this morbid interregnum that there is no singular ism and no singular alternative order, a fact that I don't mourn. And I'll just stop my remarks there, and hopefully we can have a bit of conversation as well. Thank you, and for your patience as well.
Thank you so much, Ilene, for a fantastic talk. Now I would like to open the floor for the Q&A session. So we still have about a half hour, if that's okay with you.
Great.
Yeah. Questions, comments? Chaatai, please.
Professor, thank you very much for such an illuminating talk. We all enjoyed a lot. So I have actually several questions regarding the talk and the book specifically. So first of all, how do you see the post-COVID crisis? Which thesis, continuity or discontinuity, would be more useful to explain this era? And how do you see, do you see any resemblance between the global financial crisis of 2008 and the post-COVID era? Mm-hmm. And I have one more, which is regarding the productive incoherence argument. So this argument is indeed challenges the continuity thesis. However, it actually acknowledges the existence of continuity or somehow reproduces it. So how do you tackle with this issue? Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Great. And
would you like to collect a few more?
I'm open to responding one-on-one or in batches, whatever you'd prefer.
Totally up to you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Maybe one-on-one. Those really great comments and questions. I thank you for all of them. I think I was just jotting some of them down. I think that there are important, just to take them maybe in a slightly different order than you raise them. I think there are interesting parallels between the period of the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis, both in terms of the way in which both crises really challenged prevailing norms and strategies and the kind of functioning of the institutions of multilateral financial governance, such as the Bretton Woods institutions, such that both crises, I think, really pushed the world forward in terms of fracturing and experimentation, a search for new strategies, and an effort at pragmatic, though of course not always successful, problem solving. So I think both events really act as kind of ruptures that reinforce this idea that there is a kind of interregnum emerging. And even to go back a bit further historically, I think the East Asian financial crisis of 1997 and 1998, which I know I mentioned only in passing, I deal with more in the book, but just given time today, I didn't talk much about the East Asian financial crisis, but I see that crisis as the kind of the beginning of the end of the second neoliberal order, something which essentially lays the groundwork for the kinds of developments that emerge in a much more significant and consistent and meaningful way during the global crisis. And I think the COVID crisis acts as yet another kind of push forward on these kinds of ideational and institutional ruptures that have so kind of animated my work. And so I think all of these three crises, East Asia, global, and the COVID crisis, act as kind of turning points or push the world more in the direction of these post-American moments in global financial governance. In terms of what the post-COVID era looks like, I know, like all of you, I struggle to imagine that era. I am so impatient to be in the post-COVID era, such that it's a bit hard from this vantage point to envision it. But I think what we can say with at least some degree of confidence about the post-COVID era is that some norms that were already under a great deal of pressure and fracture during the global financial crisis have been kind of further fractured. The idea of, budget deficits as being inherently problematic and something to be avoided, I think has been further challenged by the way in which governments that have had fiscal headroom, and of course not all have, but how they've had to spend deeply into the COVID crisis. And so I think in some sense, expansionary policies have been further normalized by the monetary and the fiscal policies that some central banks and some governments have pursued. In this era, the idea that central banks play a role as lender of last resort, not just for the financial sector, but also for the real sector, has been kind of normalized as well. The insufficiency of the Bretton Woods institutions in the face of the COVID crisis, I think, has been really dramatic. The IMF, despite all of the talk by IMF leadership about using giant bazookas, I know that phrase giant bazookas kind of keeps appearing. Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva keeps talking about using giant bazookas to fight the economic and the public health challenges that are faced by so many countries. But despite that, the IMF has only used about 10% of its lending capacity during the COVID crisis. And so I think, the fact that during the global crisis, the Bretton Woods institutions proved themselves inadequate to the task of responding to the crisis, which is something that helped create space for new actors to step into that financial void. I think the reticence of the Bretton Woods institutions to lend deeply into the COVID crisis also further undermines the legitimacy and the singular role of the Bretton Woods institutions, and helps to make a case for the necessity of a much more kind of polycentric global financial architecture that has more actors. And in terms of the last interesting question that you raised about, what do I think about this idea of productive incoherence at the present time? I have to admit, and I know a colleague, when I presented some work earlier this year, said to me, productive incoherence was a lot more fun during the global financial crisis than it is during the COVID crisis. And I understood his kind of, witty comment to say that, that there was more productivity in the incoherence during the global crisis than there is right now. And I've in fact come to really think about both the productive and the destructive aspects of incoherence, because I think during the COVID crisis, we really have, you know, an important mix of both opportunities that are presented, the kinds of openings that I emphasize, but also, of course, you know, again, when we think about the incredible costs of the failure to have a coordinated strategy in the face of the global pandemic, you know, is perhaps the most important way in which we can see destructive incoherence playing out right now. So I think it is important to think again about both productive and destructive aspects of this argument, kind of beyond the arguments I developed in the book. So thank you. No, I'm sorry, and I'll try to be more concise. Those are three really meaty questions. Maybe I spoke a bit too long.
That's fine. Excellent. Ecem is next in line.
I would like to say I really like this talk, and I'm very appreciative for that. My question is about the possible problems about the process of seeing the mixed ideas together. For instance, the talk between China and the United States in Alaska was actually quite far from negotiation. So I would like to ask that if the prejudice between countries and the assumptions from their foreign policies would actually slower their process, or would it actually not matter? My question is that. Thank you.
Yeah, Ejin, great question. It really was, I think, fascinating and also disturbing to see the kind of level of conflict in Alaska last week. It really suggested that maybe the Trump period has a much more kind of longer shadow than we would have liked to imagine over US-China relations as played out. And I think that what it is also indicative of is that in some ways the Biden administration may continue with some of the kind of posturing toward China, and that the Chinese government, of course, was a very astute pupil of the primary and secondary sanctions programs that were such important features of the Trump administration. So I think we can expect the trade war, the currency war, the conflict between US-led Bretton Woods institutions and Chinese-led institutions playing out, those kinds of conflicts playing out when it comes to things like debt suspensions, debt cancellations, haircuts on debt for countries in the global South and the global East, and US-led institutions and Chinese institutions kind of conflicting with one another about those strategies. And in that sense, really reinforces this idea of incoherence in global financial governance, rather than thinking of the two great powers finding some degree of common ground. In the coming years, it looks less likely to be so, such that this kind of messier architecture and proliferation of isms and strategies, I think, to continue rather than finding some kind of meeting place in the middle between US and China, such that we may be looking much more at bilateralism, bipolar orders, rather than the resurrection of a US-led order. So I think in some sense, it's also consistent with the argument about a post-American order that the US cannot really realistically even assume that it could restore its role in the world because of its relationships with China right now. So thank you.
Stepan, please.
Professor Grabel, thank you very much for your talk. It was a great presentation, very thought-provoking. I would like to ask you, what do you think, should there be some kind of a consensus among policymakers and theoreticians for a new system, for a new order to emerge from the current status quo? Of course, the consensus might be, again, as a coherence, as a matter of degree, but at the same time, I just wonder, do you think, for example, during the 1970s, 1980s, there was kind of a consensus on neoliberalism among policymakers and theoreticians? And if yes, then for a new order to emerge, should there be a similar one? Thank you.
Great question, Stephen. I think in terms of maybe going in reverse order of your questions, I think during the Second American Order, we could say that, among there was an expert consensus, there was an elite consensus, there was a consensus among powerful policymakers, spreading across the global financial community. There was an epistemic consensus and certainly a policy and institutional consensus that was backed by state power, that was backed by financial power, that was backed by the power of the economics profession, of my own discipline, that essentially valorized ideas that were consistent with neoliberalism, and sort of rewrote history to suggest that, the second order, the ideas of the first order Keynesianism were an unmitigated failure. So yes, there was a consensus of a very particular sort that was backed, again, by ideas, by power, and by the success of an intellectual monoculture, the kind of creation of an intellectual monoculture. So I think that does really characterize the second order. And of course, it was associated with inequalities of all sorts, in financial instability, and the destruction of the planet as well. So there were obviously many severe negative consequences associated with the resilience of that expert consensus. In terms of the kind of more forward-looking question of, do I think there should be, do I hope that there is a new consensus going forward? I guess I have to say that to the extent that I would hope that there's a consensus, I hope that that consensus would be a relatively thin consensus. That is to say that there could be agreement on the primacy of some things, some of the goals that are embedded in the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 agenda, the right to clean water, the right to food, et cetera, the right for a decent living standard, the right to education, et cetera, human rights of different sorts, women's rights. So those would be the element of a consensus that I would be excited about. What I would be unexcited about would be a thicker consensus that valorizes one set of economic ideas as being universally applicable and somehow ahistorical, one set of economic institutions, one size fits all policies. And I suspect, from your body language, that you would agree with that. So consensus, yes, but of a kind of thin variety rather than the kind of thick overarching variety that really made experimentation extremely difficult once you move out of just a few large developmental states, and which kind of dismiss the idea that heterogeneity is something that's important and valuable, but rather privileged homogeneity and convergence. And privileged investor interests over other interests. I guess I could go on, but I think probably get the idea. So thank you.
Great. Aykut is next. Aykut, go on, please.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was amazing. My question will be, what do you think will be the main differences of Chinese institutions in regards to the American institutions? Because, United States just paused on its neoliberal economic policies, which are basically for short-term interests and for the 1% percentage of the elites. But what do you think will be the main difference of Chinese trying to change the Western financial system? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great question, Aykut. Thank you. I think that, when we look at Chinese-led financial institutions, we can see a couple of things which we may think of as advantages, comparing lending investment strategies to those associated with the Bretton Woods institutions, Chinese institutions, maybe as an outgrowth of China's approach to economic policy more broadly, tend to play the long game and make strategic bets that might not seem economically always advantageous in the short run, but which provide, opportunities for the Chinese economy over the long run, thinking about infrastructure investments and the securing of natural resources through Chinese-led investments that are very much part of Chinese economic policies, sort of long-range vision. Chinese lending and Chinese institutions do not tie the receipt of funds, whether we're talking about aid or loans or investments, to the adoption of a singular policy, either neoliberal policy or policy that's more consistent with Chinese policy norms. So in that sense, we'd say that they are more conducive to policy autonomy among recipient countries. Those are benefits from many respects, but of course, we also have to recognize that Chinese loans are also highly non-transparent. It has been really difficult to even move forward on things like debt suspensions during the COVID crisis, partly because it's so difficult to untangle how much countries owe to China and to which Chinese institutions, because you've got a multiplicity of institutions, Chinese-led institutions that are making loans sometimes to the same country. And when we think about some of the recent defaults during the COVID crisis, the Zambian government was the first country to default on its international loans during the COVID crisis. It's been joined by Argentina, I think Belize, Ecuador, Lebanon, Suriname. These are, among the first tranche of defaulting countries. And there are many factors in those defaults. Some of that is the inadequacy of the G20's debt suspension sustainability initiative, which really made it impossible for countries to utilize the opportunity to suspend their debts. But another complication was that we have now a very messy architecture of international lending, where you've got loans made by many bilateral governments, including but not only China, and it's been very hard again to disentangle those loans, and some debt suspension programs require that it be known how much is owed, to whom, under what terms, and that has been almost impossible to figure out. And indeed, not to defend the IMF overly, but some of the IMF's reticence to suspend some debt payments owed to it has to do with the fact that it has to be aware of all of the other debt obligations, because many IMF member countries, as well as other governments that have made loans to countries in the global South and the global East, do not want to suspend debts if any debt suspension is going to provide breathing room to repay loans to China. So that kind of messiness and lack of transparency is one of the downsides of Chinese lending, despite the fact that it's not associated with the kind of convergence and the structural adjustment that we associate with Bretton Woods institution loans. So it's a kind of mixed picture, I'd say, but I guess maybe the last thing I would just add to that is the fact that Chinese finance is an option, gives countries the opportunity to engage in forum shopping, like to play off legacy lenders against new lenders. That can be helpful sometimes to smaller countries. It also means that countries that are isolated in the global financial system, that can't get loans from other countries, can get loans from China. If that's all that's available to some countries, it's obviously important, particularly when we talk about the economic and the public health crises that are so important right now. So Chinese lending does fill some of the void in the global financial architecture. It does provide some competition. That competition may or may not push the Bretton Woods institutions into better behaviors, more modernized, responsive behaviors, but we don't know, but I think that that's at least a possibility. Thank you.
Great. Selver Hocam.
Thank you for such a great talk. My question is about the role of actors, actors in this process of forming new alternative types of institutions. I'm curious about your views about the powerful actors in the US context and the China context. Those groups of actors that have been hit or widely affected by the contradictions of the global capitalist order. Like, how do you see their role in this process? Which groups, do you see any parallels between those powerful actors, interest groups in China that are promoting or pushing for alternative forms of institutions and those in the States?
Good. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that there is some appetite among powerful actors in many European contexts, in the US context, in the Chinese context, as you rightly noted, that are really trying to kind of navigate the contradictions of the current order to kind of find a new role in that order to either build or recapture market share that they appear that they've lost. And that some of the kinds of innovations and partnerships that are emerging are, partly a response, a kind of cynical or self-serving efforts at self-preservation to kind of find a new place in this order. And some of the kinds of innovations in world finance, I'm thinking now about the kind of cryptocurrencies and all of this sort of new financial products that I sometimes struggle to even understand the logic of, that to some extent we might think of those as an effort to kind of build new markets where old markets have kind of disappeared, and to try to create a new kind of monopolized space within global finance, given that some of the old spaces have been ceded to other actors like China and other lenders. And I think even when we look at the very preliminary efforts by the European Union to create Instex, again, which is another kind of financial platform that is under the hood of the global financial system. Essentially, like if you look under the hood in the sense of a car, we see the SWIFT system and the chip system. These are messaging systems, and essentially systems where financial flows are recorded and the kind of way in which money quite literally moves around the world. US financial power, particularly in the second financial order, put the US at the center of those financial networks. And we have actors, as you noted, in China that are pushing forward on the creation of SIPs, which is an alternative to the SWIFT system. The European Union has begun this plan for Instex, which is an alternative to the CHIPS system. And I think that those represent kind of efforts to both insulate from the US, but also to create alternatives or kind of parallel systems over the long run to US financial control. So I think we have a lot of maneuvering going on, again, some of which is kind of exciting and interesting, and others may just protect countries from the exercise of power by particular actors that we may think is useful as a protective device, and in other cases, not so useful. Great, thank you.
Yeah. Ture Hocam is next in line.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. That was very interesting, yes, and I did actually have a chance to look at the chapter that you seem to refer quite a lot to, and it's definitely interesting. Just a brief question, because all of this deals with the financial system, monetary policy. How does all of this, the way that you see it, connect up to issues related to the real economy? How does it connect up to production? How does it connect up to capitalism? Is that an ism that is fixed? How do you see this realm of finance and things monetary, in a sense, play together with or against what is happening in the so-called real economy? I'm a little bit curious about that. Yeah. A brief other issue is when it comes to all the kind of unconventional kind of monetary measures that we see kind of being implemented, and I agree with a lot of it. I mean, to refer to what is going on now as neoliberalism doesn't make much sense. You know, we are kind of beyond that. But when you talk about embedded liberalism again, is that reduced to social protection? And how much of the measures that we have actually seen being implemented across countries have social protection as an aim rather than as a means, potentially connecting that back up to capitalism and its preservation? I'm just curious your take on, making these linkages. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, really interesting question. Thank you. I think the kind of first part of your question about the connection to all of this in terms of the real economy is a very interesting one. So many people have started to talk about financialization, the kind of structural transformation of capitalism, and this idea that we are now in an era of capitalism that is a kind of a variety that's significantly different from its previous incarnations, that has been financialized to a very high degree, such that even what we would think of as real sector activities have been kind of imbued with financialization and securitization in all respects. And I think that is a real phenomenon, and it's a troubling phenomenon, and we see it playing out as well in terms of this idea of like a K-shaped economy. I know people, some people have written about a K-shaped global economic recovery, and I think the K part I agree with, but of course we're not in an economic recovery, so it seems wrong to think about economic recoveries at the present time. But this idea of a K-shape, of saying that the world economy that has, the parts of it that have been heavily financialized have been doing very well during the pandemic, right? It's been a very good pandemic for financial capitalism around the world, and a very bad pandemic for the real sector, and of course for the lived experiences of anyone but the wealthy and elites around the world. And so I think in some sense, the pandemic has kind of deepened that trend toward financialization and toward this idea of a K-shaped world economy, again, that is highly uneven in its lived experience of a crisis, and perhaps during the post-crisis environment as well. And I think actors in the real sector, whether we're talking about industrial capital or workers in the informal sector, thinking about another aspect of the real sector, the amount of suffering in real sector experiences around the world is truly massive. That there have been just a few large firms that have prospered during the pandemic, and again, I think that just moves the world economy further in the direction of this highly unequal, like the worst version of capitalism, the most unequal version of capitalism, the most debilitating version of capitalism. I think the COVID pandemic has really kind of revealed even more the ravages of capitalism, of the neoliberal variety and of the uneven variety, but it has also kind of furthered some of those developments, things like automation and redundancy of workers who might be lower skilled, lower educated workers who've been made redundant, or whose lives have been sacrificed in order to do things like show up for work because they have to during the crisis. So I think if Marx were with us, he would see the pandemic, one can imagine, as really exemplifying all of the worst features of capitalism and deepening them. In terms of the second comment that you made about social protection, I think the experiences of social protection policies during the pandemic have been so heterogeneous around the world, where we've had governments that to different degrees have utilized policies of social protection that were either kind of consistent with their more like social democratic model of capitalism to begin with. And then you have, countries such as my own that unveiled, programs of social protection that by US standards were generous, but of course were extraordinarily inadequate and paled in comparison to programs of social protection in other national contexts. So I think this kind of heterogeneity and incoherence has been well on display when we look at the nature and the character and the depth of social protection programs around the world. And of course, when we look at countries in the global South and the global East that were already in a really financially fragile position prior to the COVID crisis, there was no fiscal headroom for programs of social protection, outside of, a minority of country context. So these experiences, I think, have been very, very uneven. So thank you.
Excellent. So moderators typically don't ask questions, but we might make an exception for myself. I would like to ask the final question of our session today. And this is going to sound a little bit off topic probably, and it's going to be a hypothetical and somewhat speculative question. So how do you think, what do you think is the appeal of the developmental state or the state capitalist mode for American policymakers and American scholarly community in general? Or if it doesn't make sense to you at all, why is that not a possibility?
I mean, it's a great and interesting question, Setkin. I mean, I find the model very appealing, but I know that that's not a surprise to you. That the features that are appealing, in particular, the kind of self-conscious nature of policy driven by a set of goals that promote employment and economic growth. These are important, I think, goals and achievements of many of the world's developmental states. In many developmental states, financial interests are subsumed to other interests in the economy, like real sector interests. And for me, maybe as a Keynesian, that's one of the most appealing aspects of developmental states. That is to say that they tend to repress finance in the interests of other objectives like employment promotion, export performance, et cetera. So that I think is really important and attractive. In terms of what's less satisfying to me about the developmental state model, I think developmental state models have a kind of coherence and homogeneity to them that suggest a kind of singular path to development, historically one oriented around heavy industry that maybe with our concerns about sustainability these days make traditional developmental state ideas feel a little bit dated because they were very much sort of driven by Gershon-Krohn's vision of what does it mean to be a developed industrialized state. I mean, obviously those ideas can be modernized if one thinks about, green developmental states. So that's maybe just a more abstract answer or response to your question. In the US context that you were asking about, whether or not the US is moving in a direction that's a little bit more consistent with a developmental state rather than a kind of kleptocratic form of capitalism that had been flourishing in the US for so long. I think that's an interesting question. One thing which might give a preliminary sense of how that question would be answered may be what happens with the patents on US developed vaccines, thinking about the current context, right? Vaccine development in the US, moved ahead of schedule, which was surprising and wonderful. It was supported by very heavy investments by the US government. And just right now, I mean, as in this week, the issue that's playing out in the US is, will those patents be protected so that the private firms that receive massive transfers of resources from the government in a kind of developmental state sense, will they get to enjoy the privatization of those profits, or will those profits be socialized in some way as part of a vaccine access program globally? The power politics around that will be interesting to observe. I feel not so optimistic that the power of large firms, whether we're talking about financial firms in the US or pharmaceutical firms, will be challenged and kind of reined in by a more kind of developmental, muscular US state. It's a bit early in the Biden administration to see that, but his economic appointments have been such an interesting mix of people who are focused on inequality, who really appreciate the important role that states play in ameliorating social and economic ills. Many of the economic appointees have been surprisingly progressive, and that's been incredibly exciting in the US. But of course, there's some old Wall Street hands kind of tucked into the administration as well. So one can imagine the meetings on economic policy feeling a little bit like faculty meetings, at least in my own department, where you get kind of competing forces. And the question is, who's going to win in that kind of struggle? And we don't know, but I have to say, I'm somewhat more optimistic than I would have imagined myself to be about the direction of at least US economic policy. As far as US engagement with the rest of the world, I'm not so sure because of what happened in Alaska last week. But I think that there have been some encouraging signs that Biden and his team have kind of gotten the message that the world has changed somewhat, and they better pay attention to things like inequality and racism to a degree that US administrations haven't in the last many decades. So we can hope, and it may be that they're kind of inside the Beltway credibility, because there's a lot of sort of old timers in the administration, buys them a degree of credibility and space that perhaps the Obama administration didn't have, given the historic nature of the Obama team. So there may be a little bit of the kind of Nixon goes to China aspect to the Biden team's domestic agenda, but we'll see. Hopefully we'll get to meet in Ankara in person in the future, and then we can talk about what's really happening.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. I hope we'll be able to realize that in the near future. So thank you so much, Ilene, for a great talk. I think it was very productive and thought-provoking for all of us. And thanks for spending a morning with us. And we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And hope to see you soon again.
I do as well. I want to thank you all for logging on in the evening and having such great and lively questions and engagement with my work. I appreciate it. And it's just, I really look forward to meeting folks in person in the future. So thank you.
Excellent.
Be well, everyone. Stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.